through the course of that research, we found that the #1 threat to Native peoples is our invisibility.
Good afternoon. Today I have Crystal Echohawk with me. Crystal is the CEO of IllumiNative. She was previously operated Echohawk Consulting. She's worked with the SMSC on a variety of different projects, including the Seeds of Native Health, has been a consultant for many things over the years. So we're really excited to have Crystal here today. She is doing some really amazing work around narrative change with IllumiNative based on some research she co-conducted that really shines some light on where we need to focus to really change the narrative in Native communities. Crystal, welcome. If you want to just maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of briefly how you got to where you are today with IllumiNative.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rebecca, for having me on today. So as you mentioned, my name is Crystal Echohawk. I'm a citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma and Kickahocky Band. And I'm founder and executive director of IllumiNative. And I'm coming to you today from the reservation of the Muskogee Creek Nation, which is also known as downtown Tulsa. And, IllumiNative is a national racial and social justice organization that really works to build power for Native peoples by, amplifying Native voices and stories and issues in order to really advance, justice and equity and self-determination for our peoples, and to really, fight against racism and discrimination that Native peoples have long faced. And so we really focus on advancing contemporary representation of Native peoples in pop culture, education, the media, and all across society.
Fantastic. I think just because Reclaiming Native Truth, the report that was issued, is kind of the foundation of a lot of work that you're doing. And I know it's the foundation of some of the work we're doing. That report informed some of what we're doing with Understand Native Minnesota and our K-12 initiative. And also, the lived experience of being a Native person growing up on a reservation with a larger community. Can you talk a little bit about the report and really what was your inspiration to kick that project off?
Yeah, definitely. Reclaiming Native Truth is something I founded and co-led, and really, as I talk about it, it's the largest public opinion research project ever done about Native peoples and by Native peoples for Native peoples. And the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community was one of our very first investors in that work, and it was a total of a $3.3 million research project. It had really never been done before. And I think, when I look back when this sort of genesis of Reclaiming Native Truth, it started back in kind of 2015. And, I've worked my whole life in Indian country. I've worked for my own tribe. I've worked for a variety of different Native nonprofit organizations, really advocating for particularly our Native youth and families, but, for tribal sovereignty and for the rights of Native peoples. And, I think, like so many of us in our lives, whether we're advocates, for Native rights or just every day as living, breathing as Native people, I think we constantly encounter this sense of like we feel invisible and not seen, not feeling like our issues are taken seriously in this country, and that, more often than not, we're reduced to caricatures and stereotypes. And I just think, about 2015, after at the time I was working for Nota Begay, who was at the time the only Native American professional golfer that had been on the PGA Tour. And I remember thinking, Nota was really advocating for the health and wellness of Native youth, and we couldn't get a lot of visibility on that issue. And I thought, man, as someone as famous as Nota, right? Like even when he's using his platform, it's just really seeing that people don't even really think our people exist, right? Beyond sort of these caricatures. And just talking to so many other tribal leaders and Native advocates, that we all shared this. And so, we just really put our minds together and thought, one of the best ways we need to start fighting this is first and foremost with data and research. And, I joined forces with people like Alvin Warren and just a whole host of really smart Native peoples to form Reclaiming Native Truth so that we could map, what are the dominant perceptions, that non-Native people have about Native Americans? And why do they think those things about us? Why do they perceive us in certain ways? Where do those perceptions and ideas come from? And how do they affect the way that we're treated? And not just in everyday life, but the way that we're treated in the courts, the way that we're treated in Congress and by, the White House and the administrations that are in power, the way that we're represented in Hollywood and the media, and even, in philanthropy and a variety of different sectors. And we wanted to be able to unpack all of this so that we could really begin to understand, why are we treated this way? Why are we so invisible in society? And how do we move forward? So it wasn't just about research to understand that. It was really about how do we set strategy to really make a difference. And, through the course of that research, we found that the number one threat to Native peoples is our invisibility. And, it was research done by, for example, Professor Sarah Shears that found that 87% of schools in the country don't teach about Native peoples past 1900. So literally generation after generation of Americans are conditioned to think that, we no longer exist, right? And probably the last thing they learned about us might have been in middle school about Wounded Knee. And that was it. Contemporary American, high school students aren't even taught in their government classes about tribal sovereignty, right? When they learn about governments in this country. We also found that, for example, in TV and film, our representation is somewhere between 0 and 0.04%. Right. And what little sort of ekes through in TV and film, again, is usually before, stories about Native peoples before 1900. And they're really based in a lot of like harmful stereotypes and red face and just really, depictions of us as alcoholic or sort of broken and sort of disappearing. Right. And then, same thing in the media. We're not covered in the news as well. Or even if you Google Native American, up until very recently, 95% of those images would come back up pre-1900 and largely of Native men. So we found that invisibility that's perpetuated by K through 12 education, media, popular culture, by government, really shapes the way that people think about us and the way that they treat us. And we found that, for example, that the majority of federal law, judges, right, judges sitting in the federal courts know little to nothing about tribal sovereignty, right? Members of Congress know very little about tribes. And as we began to pull and understand that, we really found that this really impacts the way that they think about us or don't think about us. And it really began to help us understand that our representation, right, is not just about political correctness. Representation of our people and really fighting for our own authorship of our representation and our contemporary representation is actually cornerstone to our fight to preserve and defend tribal sovereignty, to protect our children, to assert, our vision for what is important for our communities. Those perceptions that are held by the American public and really powerful key institutions impact us in really dramatic ways. And so that's why we have to fight really hard to, disrupt that invisibility, to smash the toxic stereotypes, and to really author and amplify our contemporary voices and issues today.
Yeah, thank you. I think that report was really a launch pad for a lot of people in Indian country. And, we know there are people that have been on the ground in their communities, addressing these disruptive narratives, these, incorrect narratives, trying to move the needle. And I think this report really provided that data that people look to say, where can we focus our efforts, and has really provided Indian country some direction. And we've seen, just amazing things happen since that report came out, and IllumiNative has launched and partnered with several other organizations across Indian country to really amplify our voice and this message. So it's been really incredible. So fast forward to IllumiNative, you want to talk about some of, your big wins, on top of the recognition for launching this report. And, I think this year you were even named by People as one of the women changing the world. Congratulations, by the way. That's amazing to see our Native sisters get that sort of recognition. But yeah, so talk a little bit about IllumiNative.
Yeah, no, thank you. Well, I mean, when we published our Reclaiming Native Truth research in 2018, I mean, we worked with more than 200 Native peoples, like stakeholders, all across the 2 years of Reclaiming Native Truth, because we didn't want this just to be an academic research project, right? This is really about how do we make change led by Native peoples. And one of the recommendations that really came out of it is that all of this research, right, which is our weapon, right, to really, fight for change for our peoples, it needed a vehicle, right? It needed to be translated into action and something to kind of like to help, be a part of this movement of many movements. And so that's when we founded IllumiNative, and it was just really informed by a lot of different Native artists and Native thought leaders and nonprofit leaders and grassroots activists that just, really helped to come together to found IllumiNative to really take this research and to translate it into action, right? And so, we're going to celebrate our 3rd birthday in June, which is really hard to believe. And it's been amazing just to see, I'm so grateful every day that this research is helpful to Native peoples everywhere, right? Because it just gives us, sort of another arrow, right, in our arsenal, right, to kind of really advance and fight for our people and our representation. And, we're really excited. I mean, I think, as I look at some of the things I think we've been able to help achieve is to really just take this research and to put it in the hands of everyday folks, right? And not just Native people, but non-Native people, because I think a lot of non-Native people, they just are ignorant. They don't understand. I mean, nearly 80% of Americans know little to nothing about us. That's what the research showed. And so, I think one of the first big wins is just gradually, starting to do education all over the country and in really influential sectors like Hollywood and the media and other places about why Native representation matters and that why Native stories need to be authored by Native peoples, right? And so I think that's really one important, thing that I'm really proud of our team, right? It's just, I think increasingly we're beginning to have a conversation about how harmful invisibility is, how harmful red face and things like mascots and that kind of toxic, harmful, representation and stereotypes are to our children and to our communities. I think we were excited. We certainly, last summer, right, when the Washington football team finally changed their name. I mean, IllumiNative can't take credit for that. We were happy to be a part of, organizing sort of the social groundswell after the murder of George Floyd. But, we stand on the shoulders of people like Suzanne Harjo and Amanda Blackhorse and thousands of Native people, including, Shakopee has been on the front lines of that mascot fight for a very long time. And so we were, really excited about, being able to be a part of that victory for all Native peoples last summer. And then shortly, thereafter, we're excited to see that the Cleveland baseball team, right, made the right decision and changed their name. I think other things that we've been excited about are, just being a part of helping to mobilize social groundswell behind the, nomination and confirmation of Secretary Deb Haaland. Because, as we looked at that, and we organized shoulder to shoulder with so many different Native organizations and groups and tribes across the country. But, that to me is the height of visibility, right? When we could see Secretary Haaland step into the role, not only as the first Native, Secretary of Interior, but the first Native Cabinet Secretary in the United States. And that, was so special. That's really shattering sort of the glass ceiling upon glass ceiling for Native women, but for Native peoples as well. And I think, all of these things that we do, we work really hard to be in collaboration and partnership with just different Native organizations and activists across the country to really continuously fight for our contemporary representation and to build power. I mean, it's not just about fighting to just be seen and heard, but it's really fighting for building our power, right? Whether that's getting more Native people elected to office, to, this week we're going to celebrate the premiere of one of the first shows ever created on television called Rutherford Falls, that was co-created by a Navajo woman, Sierra Ornelas Teller, right? And its co-star, Janice Schmieding, is Lakota from Cheyenne River, and she stars opposite Ed Helms from The Office. And it's, to date, the largest Native writers' room in history. And so these are the kinds of issues that we are, really passionately, working on and helping to amplify. And it's really, I think, an exciting time right now for Native peoples. I think we're winning a lot of big victories on Native representation that belong to all of us.
Yeah, I agree. And I think when we talk about all this, it's so inspiring. But I think for me too, as a mom, thinking about all these wonderful shining examples that my children now have to look, up to and forward to, and see themselves represented, and know that, that glass ceiling has been shattered in many ways, and that they can really reach for the stars. And I think that's really important for our youth across Indian country. And I think, our youth are really inspiring and have been a huge part in leading some of these movements. You as a mom too can probably, I'm sure you understand, but you've had the opportunity to work with some of the youth. And can you talk a little bit about, their passion and how excited they are to be part of all this?
Yeah, definitely. And, I think a driving force for so many of us, is just being a mom, right? And when I think about my daughter, I think about my grandchildren, I think about my nieces and nephews, and that's every day why I get up and I know that this work on representation is so important. And you feel that too, right? We know that because we never saw ourselves growing up, right? Unless it was just a caricature. And somebody sort of making fun of us, right, in some kind of way. And, I think our youth are everything. I mean, I tell you, this generation that is coming up is so smart. They're so savvy. And there is just such a boldness and a fearlessness, right, that I think that they really have, that is enough is enough. Right. And I think, this is so generational. And I think so much about our ancestors and our grandparents and everything they had to come through. Right. But I think now, like, this generation of our young people, it's just, they're done being erased. They're done being caricatured. And they really are making their voices heard. And I think everything from, they were part of the genesis of Standing Rock. Right. It was really Native youth that were such a catalyst for that. And when I think about so much of the work happening right now all across the country on narrative change and really Native representation, our young people are just like, we're done. We are tired of being misrepresented, and they really want to center Native voices and their stories. Because I think too, like, our Indian country is so diverse. We're not a monolith, right? We're rapidly changing, as Indian country and as our own tribal nations. And I think, I just see our young people really leading the charge, and they're so talented. And I'm inspired every day by their energy and their work.
Yeah. So when I think about, being a young person and all the, things that inspired me and set me on the path that I'm on, was there something, specific that you can point to in your childhood or in your experience that, kind of led you down this path that you're on?
I think it was, I was really fortunate to grow up in a family where, almost everyone in my family, really fought for Native rights, right? And in some way was just really working in service to, Indian country to our, our Pawnee tribal community, or our urban, Native community where I grew up, kind of the Denver Boulder area in Colorado. And, my dad was Indian water rights attorney, and, he got his start at the Department of Justice and eventually, went into private practice. My Uncle John is, the executive director of the Native American Rights Fund. And I grew up constantly surrounded by Native attorneys all the time, in dinner conversation, family gatherings. That's just how we grew up. That was a way of life. And I remember, I think I had to make a book when I was like in 3rd grade, and I wrote my first story about modern day warriors. And I had all these pictures of all these natives with briefcases, and they were my superheroes growing up, and I think really from a very early age on, I just knew in some kind of way that I wanted to work for and with Native peoples, right? To really to make a change, to really ensure that we every day wake up and our rights, tribal sovereignty are respected. So
yeah, and I think talking about tribal sovereignty is one of the most important things that we can do, so that people understand really what is the unique position and relationship that tribal people have with the United States. And I think there's so many misconceptions around that, and which is why I think it's really important to focus on education, and not just education, in a K through 12 system, but education, all the way up, as you said, when you talk about judges that are sitting on the federal bench, and that people really understand tribal sovereignty. How do you think IllumiNative and the Reclaiming Native Truth Project has really uplifted that and helped maybe shine some light on tribal sovereignty, and maybe change the way people think when it comes to our elected officials, our judges? And do you think it's having an impact at that level?
I hope it's starting to have an impact at that level, but I think we have so much work to do, right? Because, that's what the research showed, is how profound that erasure has been, right? And when you look at, for example, that the majority of law schools in this country do not offer federal Indian law classes. Right. And when we interviewed, it was Pipestem Law that conducted all our political and judicial research for Reclaiming Native Truth. And I think out of almost all the federal judges and law clerks that they interviewed, the majority had never taken a federal Indian law class. That's terrifying. I mean, when you think about a judge presiding, over a major dispute between, in business or contract law, and they had never taken that, but yet they're rendering decisions. This is a huge issue, and this isn't just to those judges. I mean, we're talking about, it's a major systems issue, right, that we have to address. So I think there's some really long-term investment that needs to happen, right? Just as we think about in that very specific instances of the courts. It should be an absolute requirement of any federal judge sitting on the federal bench that they have that clear, background in federal Indian law. And we found, there were some of the most disturbing things I actually found from Reclaiming Native Truth were direct quotes from federal judges and law clerks that called federal Indian law irrational and nonsensical. That when tribes talk about, being nations and tribal sovereignty, they're just puffing up their chests. And so there's so much more work to be done, right? Because it really just shows this isn't just about a couple bad apples. And we hear that a lot about things. Oh, well, that's just a bad apple over there. This is about systemic racism, right? This is really about white supremacy. And so there is a lot, while I feel like we're making some differences, and it helps to have someone like Secretary Holland in the position that she's in now, or that we now have, I think, 5 members of, Native members of Congress, right? And we look at Native representation in state houses and other places. There's so much work to do, right? But it's not just up to Native peoples to do this work. It's about everyone. And I think, what's so important, whether we're talking about K through 12 education, universities, to different things, we have to understand that learning about Native peoples and learning about tribal sovereignty, that's a good thing for all Americans, right? Because tribes is first and foremost, we obviously are there to take care of our tribal citizens and our people, but the good decisions that our tribes are making benefit all Americans. Like, I think how many, instances like with the Keystone XL pipeline, those tribes that stood up on that issue were not only just standing up to protect their own water and cultural resources and sacred places, they were also standing up for the drinking water that affected, I believe, over 30 million Americans, right, in major agriculture. And so tribal sovereignty is a good thing. And I think we have so much more education to do with a lot of Americans, that I think this is about generational change. That is going to take all of us kind of pulling together across these different sectors to really, combat, that invisibility, to really combat the systemic racism that plagues our key institutions in this country. But that change is possible. And I think we saw a lot of acceleration, particularly in 2020 and coming into this year. And there's so much positive things to talk about, but when we look at this is really about generational change that's going to take all of us to get it done.
And like you said, it's definitely a slow process, but I think one of the really encouraging pieces is that out of that research, came the want that people want to know more about Native people, which is really encouraging, because it means when we talk about Indian education for all in states, or developing curriculum, or working with higher ed institutions to make sure, teacher training includes Native history and how to teach that, and good resources, but also opens the door for Hollywood to say, what, we can market this, we can sell this. People want to know about modern Native people, along with historical. So I think that really was an eye-opener, again, to have that data in a lot of different sectors to be able to generate some movement.
Absolutely. And I think that's why we knew, because, 9 times out of 10, Native people don't show up in any data, right? So we're sort of erased constantly in data that drives major decisions across every sector in our country. And so that was why it was so important for us to do that research. But, when we went out, over 70% of Americans supported significant changes in K through 12 education, in curricula, to ensure that it reflected teaching not only about Native history, but about contemporary Native people. And that's a huge level of support. And when we went in and we did focus groups with teachers, right? Teachers were among the first to admit that they knew that was the one subject that was one of the, one of the worst they were teaching, in the sense that they knew that they were not teaching from good materials or accurate materials, right? And they knew that, and they want to do better, right? And I think we find so much support from a lot of educators, right, that want to do the right thing. And it's like, we just have to now really figure out, how do we bring the resources to bear, right, to ensure that we can get these sweeping changes, like at the policy level, right, the state level, district level, as we look at policy change, but that kind of the resources to do that level of curriculum development that can bring together tribes and Native educators and Native communities together with school districts and schools to really craft meaningful, culturally competent curriculum that is reflective of a particular state's reality and relationships with Native people, both past, present, and looking forward to the future. And that, it's a big undertaking, and it's, everything that, Shakopee is doing to kind of help to lead this charge in Minnesota makes it such a model. And we're seeing increasingly that there's a real movement across a number of different states in the country to adopt Native American education for all. North Dakota just had sort of, a recent victory. There's been some different victories in Washington and California. Here in Oklahoma, they're looking at some things. I think Arizona, so there's definitely energy and momentum on this issue around K-12 curricula.
Tribes are modern, thriving governments, and Native Americans make important contributions to our state every day. My tribe's campaign, Understand Native Minnesota, is about ensuring that public school students across the state understand Native history, cultures, and governments. Our campaign recently launched a newsletter to help share timely information about Native issues. Do you have any advice for teachers who, they want to teach this, but they, sometimes it's a little intimidating, especially when you're teaching, close to Native communities and you have Native students in your classroom, and it's not like teaching about ancient Egyptians that are going to correct you if you, get something wrong, or so any sort of advice for our teachers on, how to embrace curriculum, maybe embrace understanding that they don't know it all, but, encouraging resources and anything you can give to our teachers listening.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the first thing is it's always about intention, right? If you have good intentions, that's number one. That's a great start. But I think, I remember talking to some folks up in Minnesota one time we were up there for a meeting and talking to the teacher, and they're like, I'm scared, right? And, I think they were a science teacher. And I was like, well, you teach about, science and space, but you're not a rocket scientist, right? Are you? You're a teacher, so, I mean, there's no reason why you can't not teach about Native history, right? But I think, increasingly because of the work that Shakopee's leading, I know you have Wash, Minnesota. I mean, you have all these sort of things that are sort of popping up. There's just unlimited, wonderful cultural resources, community resources, right? To really seek advice from. I know that there's more and more curricula and other kinds of things that are being developed. And I think it's just about reaching out and making some of those connections. I think, if you look at the history books that are in sort of circulation, that's not the great place to look, right? But increasingly, there's a lot of online resources, right, to teach about Native history, particularly within your state, in this case, Minnesota, but, other places. There's also just, by going to different organizations like IllumiNative or even, NCI, or there's just a variety of different ones that, sometimes there's really good educational videos and sort of resources. And at IllumiNative, we have an entire curricula that we developed, online curricula that we developed in partnership with the National Indian Education Association, for, I think, K through 6th grade, right? Online resources that were just ways of teaching about Native peoples, but in math and science, in English. I mean, just all kinds of ways that you can really, you don't just have to teach about Native peoples just in a historical context. There's sort of different ways you can kind of bring that into different subjects. And so there's a whole resource base on our website at www.illuminatives.org. We also partnered with an organization called Amplifier last year to do an educational series and some online educational activities to learn about contemporary Native leaders like Suzanne Schoen Harjo or Joy Harjo, who is the first Native American U.S. poet laureate. So there's a lot of those types of resources. But I think the main thing is to connect with the Native nonprofit organizations and tribes in your area. If there's opportunities to virtually or have someone in your classroom come in and share their history, I think is another really important way to do that.
Yeah, thank you. I guess you've been at this for a little while. What are some of the really important lessons you've learned along the way about doing this work, about narrative change?
I think having the research, right, and that what was life-changing for me was to understand that this is systemic racism, right? This is about big systems. This isn't just about this particular instance of, how my daughter was treated at her school by a teacher, right? Or how, we're left out of this over here, or, not included in that, or we see, some harmful representation in a movie. Like, it's a one-off. It was really, I think, first and foremost, understanding that this is about big systems, about our government, right? And that we don't have enough Native people representing us at every level of government outside of our tribal nations. In education and pop culture, media, and all of that. And I think that really helped to understand sort of the fight. It kind of put the fight into perspective, that this is really about systemic racism. I think it's also really important that none of us can do this work in isolation or in a vacuum, right? This is about a movement of many movements. And the more that we can find ways, not only as Native peoples, to come together, right, to really collaborate and think about where we really join in our advocacy, right, whether it's all of us pulling together to get Deb Haaland, nominated and confirmed, or to mobilize the Native vote, or to push for policy change at a state level to ensure that, schools are required to teach about Native American education. We have to work together. And so collaboration is really important. I think the other thing that I learned through the research but also the practical work is that allies are really important. And, we can shout from the rooftops, we can push, really hard in Indian country, but because that erasure is so profound, and especially in this moment when we're so polarized, we need allies to stand shoulder to shoulder with us, right? And I really truly believe, after I've been out now for a few years, kind of pounding the pavement with this research and talking to people, I think the majority of people out there want to do the right thing. They just don't know better, right? And so it's really important that we educate, non-natives, right? That we really bring them on board to be allies and to really, take our lead on these issues, right? And stand shoulder to shoulder with us. And, and I think also the final thing I'll say, just particularly in this moment, is that, we really need to be looking at Black communities and, other people of color, because we're all, facing, the consequences of systemic racism and white supremacy in this country. And I think the more that we can really turn to one another, and I think there's, I think traditionally there's been divisions sowed between different communities of color in this country. And I think there's so much work that we can do to kind of dispel some of the misinformation and stereotypes, and false narratives, I think, that even exist between communities of color. And the more that we can stand together and support one another, I think that's how big change happens. And when you look back to all the things that happened in 2020, from, the mascot change, to looking at, the outcome of the election. I mean, it's really when Native peoples, can stand with our allies, big things happen and big change is possible.
And to that point, with that change comes some really hard conversations and, a reckoning of sorts. When you think about colonization and some of the genocidal policies that came with that to make way for, the settlement of America, and having to kind of internalize that as a nation, a group of people, and acknowledge that, people of color are in some of the situations they're in with, health disparities and education gaps and stuff like that, because of a system that was essentially set up to exclude and kind of keep down. So how do we, move forward and have these hard conversations, but try to not have, maybe hard feelings? Because we want to have these conversations, but we don't want anyone to, feel responsible for what happened in the past, but maybe just acknowledge it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's increasingly harder to have these conversations just because of how divided, polarized this country is. And I think that one of the things that the research really showed us is that one of the ways, like if you come at somebody hard, right, and you're going to talk at them, right, they're going to shut down. None of us are going to hear one another. It doesn't matter where you come from, right? But I think when we can really find ways to center our values, and I think we share a lot of values, and for example, when we talked about mascots, right? When we talk about that and, mascots and red face, that causes psychological harm to our children. Dr. Stephanie Freiberg has led that research for more than a decade to really show the harm. And so, I think when we talk to people, for example, we'd say, we all value our children, right? You value your children. We value our children. Children are sacred. Children are special. We want to protect them and keep them safe from harm. And that when you can center something on values, right? It's like, oh, yeah, we can agree on that. Then there's an opening to start doing some education about what's the history is, what's happening in the moment, in terms of the harm that's caused in this instance, mascots. And the solution forward is just, let's eliminate this, right? Let's ensure that all children, right, are safe and healthy and happy. And that includes Native American children, right? So here's the solution, right? Here's the call to action that we can all get on board with. And I think when you can go on that journey, when we can find these ways to connect on values, when we can help, people to see, particularly white people who, carry with them a lot of white privilege, right? They can't always understand the harms and the effects of racism. And when we can find ways to kind of help them to really step into our shoes, to kind of understand not only what's happened in the past, but the way it affects us today. And that's what's so important is a lot of people will say, well, that happened a long time ago, get over it. What people don't understand is how all of that continues to affect us today through contemporary institutions and policies and the way that we're sort of continuously sort of dehumanized, and misrepresented, because I think it serves a larger agenda sometimes to do that for us, right? Because if people really had to reckon with the treatment of Native peoples in this country and what continues to go on, that gets a little bit uncomfortable, right? But I think we have to, for people to understand that instead of just focusing on call out culture and cancel culture and all these sort of terms, I think it's finding ways to call people in so that we can have real conversations that can, hopefully lead to positive action and change.
Yeah. And I think there's now a platform too. We have more Native people telling their own stories, more communities interacting with the greater community, because the world today, we just can't live by arbitrary boundaries, and whether we like it or not, we're all interconnected. But I think a lot of times we focus on, the disparities across Indian country and Indian communities. But I mean, really, when you look around, our communities are doing some really amazing things. And while, I think this pandemic highlights, the contributions that Native people have to the larger community, while we've been hit really hard by COVID and Native communities around the country have lost a lot of people, they're right there making sure the greater community gets vaccinations along with their community. Their tribal public health systems have really done a really good job of protecting their communities. And so there's been a lot of collaboration and a lot of really great things going on across Indian country. So I think it's important to, talk about those too when we have these conversations and not just focus on maybe some of the things we wish were going better.
No, it's absolutely true. And I think, on the one hand, for example, when the pandemic first hit, it wasn't covered, right? And you talk about, that was sort of the realization that invisibility can actually be a matter of life or death, right? And initially, I think tribes weren't even included in the CARES Act, right? It took a lot of tribes and tribal advocates to fight to make sure that our people were included within that. And I think initially during the pandemic, people wanted to focus on the devastation at Navajo and oh my gosh, they have no running water. And let's just talk about how broken and poor and pitiful the Navajos are. But the untold story was how much Navajos were organizing. And when the federal government was nowhere to be found, you had grassroots advocates, the tribe, like really organizing, working to take care of its people. Or I look here in Oklahoma and, our vaccination rates are relatively high here. We're making a lot of progress, but that's because the tribes have stepped up and opened up mass vaccination sites. And I'm sure it's like that in Minnesota as well. So, I mean, I think, the more that we can continue to do to amplify those stories, because that's the harm that's been caused over decades and decades and hundreds of years, right? Is really that erasure of the true history and stories of Native people, which we're not pitiful and broken. we're thriving, we're resilient, we're innovating, and there's just so many remarkable things happening despite the challenges. And I hope, as a country, as we're in this moment, right, where I think maybe hopefully we're starting to see some light at the end of the tunnel. There's an opportunity to really imagine a new norm for our communities and our country, that people really understand that tribes have an important role at the table, right? As we think about solutions, not only for Native communities, but for the communities, cities, and states that we're living in. And I think this is a really important time. And I hope that we can continue to uplift these stories, right? And find ways to bring people together, because we're facing a lot of big struggles and issues in this country. And it's going to take all of us to chart a pathway forward, and Native peoples have a lot to contribute to that.
So what is your kind of plan or path for IllumiNative for the next couple of years? Do you have, an end goal? Like, what would be the culmination of this work? What would be that outcome that you're hoping to see?
That we go out of existence, right? So much of our work is about fighting for the visibility, right, of Native peoples, and sort of, our ability to author our own stories, and to really, by changing the story, so to speak, right? When we talk about narrative change, narratives are stories. We have the ability to change the future. So, that's the long-term vision. I mean, I think, over the next couple of years, we're doing more research. And one of our big new research projects that we launched in partnership with the University of Michigan, the Center for Native American Youth, and the Native Organizers Alliance is called the Indigenous Futures Project. And we launched it actually last year, right in the middle of the pandemic. And it was the largest survey ever done of Native peoples. We had over 6,400 Native peoples from all 50 states, representing 401 tribes, participate. And we really got to poll them on everything from the impact of COVID, from health to finances to mental health, to really asking them about what are the kind of most urgent priorities they see within their communities, to their experiences with racism and discrimination, and their visions for the future. And so that was amazing to see, just, how many Native peoples participated, and to really be able to uplift Native voices about what's most important to us. And so we were able to uplift a lot of that research during the 2020 election cycle, which was really important. And so we're actually going to be doing round 2 of that. Starting this summer, we're going to field the next survey. And we just want to look at how, again, like Reclaiming Native Truth, that data was so, I think, helpful to Indian country, is how the Indigenous Futures Survey can continue to really be of service to tribes and Native communities all over the country. So that research piece is really big, and continuing to do audience research, like how do we continue to tackle invisibility, to tackle sort of misinformation and stereotypes, and move non-Native audiences to really be able to just see us for who we are as human beings in the 21st century. So research is a big part. We're doing a lot of work in Hollywood, and really working with most of the major studios to just really, advocate for contemporary Native representation, and that increasingly that they just don't hire Native people's consultants, right, and one-off, but they're really bringing in Native writers and creators to formulate these stories, and that they're Native people being hired behind the camera and in front of the camera, right? And we're really authoring those stories. I think we also do a lot of advocacy, and really focusing on what we can do within the media to ensure better news coverage, and accurate news coverage of Native issues regarding Native people. And just, always, I think one of the big things that we continuously are just always fighting for or working on is rapid response communications. And when we see an opportunity to really, help to advance something positive about Native representation, or sometimes it means also standing up when we see something really harmful happening in the media or pop culture elsewhere, to do that. And I would say the final thing is that we're definitely going to be looking towards the 2022 midterm elections, because I think, you know, so much of what we do is around how do we build power for Native peoples. And I think that voting is one very important way that we're going to build power through representation. And the Native vote really proved itself to be, you know, a powerful force in the outcome of the 2020 election. And I think the 2022 midterms are going to be really important. And I think Native peoples have an opportunity to continue to make our voices heard, to make sure our voices are heard by different politicians, and that hopefully we're going to be electing more and more Native people to office.
Yeah. I think one of the barriers to being really effective in the election cycle is some of the laws on the books requiring IDs, and there's different things that Native communities are definitely impacted. As IllumiNative, working with communities to organize around issues like that don't only affect Native communities, but affect other communities of color also.
Yeah, through our Indigenous Speakers Project, right, we did a lot of, a lot of the survey dealt with voting rights and access to voting. And so, we found, I think over 30% of Native peoples reported barriers to voting. A lot of, and particularly Native young people, right, also face a lot of barriers to voting. So a big part of our work is always using that sort of data as an advocacy point, and to really uplift this so that it's very much seen and heard by the media, by the general public, but to also, to a lot of people within the progressive movement, right, who are fighting right now on voting rights. I think oftentimes, even in the progressive wings of movements around, things like voting rights, they don't always see us, right? We're not always included in that. So I think anything that we continuously can do to uplift issues around, restrictions on voting or barriers to voting for our people, but also the power and importance of the Native vote. And I think that was such a big part of the work that we did with our Natives Vote 2020 campaign that we did with the Native Organizers Alliance, was just to continuously pound away that Native peoples can no longer be ignored. And that, I think, there's a lot of misinformation out there that Native peoples don't vote, or we're such a small population that our vote is fairly insignificant. When, we found through our survey, for example, that in the 2018 elections, that 77% of people reported voting. Our people are incredibly active and engaged around voting, and they really pay attention to candidates' platforms on Native issues. I mean, I think a lot of our folks are very sophisticated. But we also have a lot of distrust of the government, and we, for good reasons, right? But I think there's a lot of people that do understand the importance of voting. So, anything that we can do to continuously uplift that, to encourage and call in our young people, and to really begin to hold candidates from all parties, really accountable, and making sure that they are hearing our voices. Because as you saw, we determined the outcome of the election in Arizona. The Native vote was critical in places like Wisconsin, Nevada, Minnesota. You guys had massive Native voter, mobilization up there. And so I think, again, that's just our work to continuously amplify the importance of Native peoples having a seat at the table, and that our voices are heard.
Yeah. And I think as important as it is to get out the vote, I think it's just as important to encourage Native people to run for office, whether it's the school board, your city council, state office, or even federal office. And I think we see, Deb Holland and Sharice Davids and Peggy Flanagan and some of those who have really shown that, it is possible for a Native American to get elected and sit in these seats. So what can we do to encourage our people to, put themselves out there and get their names on the ballots?
Well, I mean, I think, some of the best marketing for that is Secretary Holland, Congresswoman Davids, and Lieutenant Governor Flanagan. I mean, I think when you track and think about when the three of them first won in 2018, and to see that the record number of Native people, and particularly Native women running for office, has been tracking upwards. Like every election cycle, it's kind of breaking the previous record. And so I think that just by seeing that, it shows us that anything's possible, because for so long, I think the message that we constantly felt is that we don't matter. We're invisible. We're less than human. And so I think that that is so inspiring for so many people, just to see not only that these women get elected, but they're having major impact, and not just major impact on Native issues, but on issues that affect their constituencies and in the states that they're serving, and on a national level. And so, but I think we have to make those investments, right, in supporting, Native people. And particularly, we have to say it, I'd love to see more Native women running for office. And so there's a lot of, different entities, like I know Advanced Native Political Leadership and others are really starting to spring up to think about how do we continuously support these pathways for Native peoples running for office. And I love what you mentioned. It's not just about running for Congress, right? But also like the amount of impact you can have on your city council, your school board, right? And all these different sort of levels within local communities and states, and in your state legislature. I mean, it's so important. And I just get excited because I feel like there's an energy and a momentum that's really happening. And I love seeing that there's Native people that are just on the front lines of a lot of big issues that, again, that don't just affect our people, they affect all Americans. And it's really exciting.
Well, I think to point out too, it's not just Native people, it's Native women. Native women leading the charge out there across the country on so many different issues. And I think that in itself, breaks that stereotype of, Native women being homemakers and, not out there leading, when the reality is, there are a long tradition in many communities of Native women really taking the lead. And we see that very front and center right now with all our Native women in these prominent positions, which is absolutely incredible and inspiring for all of us.
Well, and I feel like, it is, I just feel like this is our time as Native women. And it's so exciting because I still get emotional. I remember the first time that I saw Deb, Peggy, and Charisse in 2018, I started crying. And I remember there wasn't a dry eye in the room, right? And I still get teared up when I see our Native women out there. But, I think, like you said, Native women have been the backbone and leaders in our communities since time immemorial. And, we have Native women tribal leaders like yourself, right, that are doing amazing things. So it's wonderful, right, that increasingly the world is sort of led onto the secret, that Native women lead. And I get so excited about that. And I think, when we were growing up, we didn't get to see that very often. And now our daughters and our grandchildren, our nieces and nephews, never again will it not be imaginable for them to be seeing, a Native person, much less a Native woman, leading in a prominent role and making a difference. And so again, I just think it's an exciting time for our people.
I think it is too. And I think it really creates more engagement in our communities. I can tell you, I have never watched so much of a confirmation hearing in my entire life. And I think I wasn't the only one, kind of appalled at a little bit of it. I'm like, you can't talk to an auntie that way, right? Because in Native communities, if, you're an auntie to everyone. And so I think it's nice to see, that power around Native women and how we all really come together and, have each other's backs in these situations.
So true. It is really about having each other's backs. And I think that's what was amazing, because up until recently, I've never done a lot in politics, right? And when we were doing everything we can to support Secretary Hollins, and during her confirmation process, it was so fun, these watch parties, right, that were being organized. And like, it was so many aunties and grandmas and, everybody on like watching, this process. And I can remember the night when we watched the final vote come in the Senate, and it just was so emotional, and just not a dry eye in the house, and what that meant for Indian country. And just, I love it. Holly Cook Macaro says it a lot, Secretary Holland being named into that role, just it suddenly made our dreams in Indian country get even bigger, right? And that's just what's so beautiful. And I just love the ways that I've seen our community come together to celebrate that, or the way that we're continuously coming together to solve big problems, or to really, care for one another.
I think, on the other side of that, there was maybe some concern that, Native people only have Native issues, that's what they're supporting. But I think when you look across the country and at our Native communities, they really have the best interest of, many of our communities, say at the next 7 generations. And you can't have the next 7 generations of just one community in mind. That really impacts everything. So, I always like to remind people that Native people are really, stewards of everybody in these situations. So I think when, it was it Paul Wellstone that when we all do better, we all do better, right? And so I think that's how I feel anyway about seeing our Native people in these leadership positions.
Well, and I think a lot about just like core values, learning about, that value, we're all related, right? And when we kind of have that core value in our hearts and minds, we begin to think about others, right? And not just others, to your point, in our own community, but all around us. And I think COVID has really, really taught us in many ways, we're all related. We all impact each other, right? We're all in this together, whether we like it or not sometimes. And that, that I do really believe, to your point, that Native leaders, Native communities can be, impactful leaders and stewards for everyone, right? We all care about things like clean water, right? We want safe places for our communities and our children to get good education. And when we think about, the jobs and just are really thinking about, we want a planet that's going to be here that our grandchildren and great grandchildren and beyond can really enjoy and continue to live on. I mean, I think those are all really important core values to Native peoples, but I think to a lot of other people in this country. So again, I'm really excited because I think there is something that's beginning to shift in this country now, where more and more people are starting to get the opportunity to see everything that Native peoples and tribal nations are doing, and that we're not the stereotype, right? Whether it's romanticized, mystical, magical Indian, or we're broken, or we're this or that, and I'm really hopeful. We got to keep pushing for it, but I think more and more people it's like that starting to open up, where people really get to see us more increasingly for who we are.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're kind of wrapping up on time here, and I don't want to keep you any longer, but we both stand on the shoulders of our ancestors who had amazing hopes and dreams for our communities. And I hope that we're fulfilling a small part of those hopes and dreams by the things we're doing today. What are your hopes and dreams, long term, for your community, for Indian country? What do you hope your children and grandchildren are leading the way on?
Just that we're thriving and continue to be thriving and happy and healthy, and just that self-determination, right, for our visions for our future, and that our children never have to go another day ever being harmed or hurt, right, by racism and by hate and by ignorance. That is something of the past, and that we can just be our full actualized selves, determining our future for our communities, and doing that in a good way as we think about our non-Native relatives, right? I pray for a time when this division and hate and the kind of level of racism, that all these things will be eliminated. That is my greatest hope, and that I get excited when I think about it. Won't be such a big deal when we see a Native television show or a Native film, because it'll become normalized, right? And we can just turn on, our TV sets or, flip on Netflix, and we'll be able to see ourselves show up in all kinds of ways, or that our kids can go to school and with other children, non-Native children, and feel represented and seen. And, and so it's all of these things I hope for, and I think they're incredibly attainable, right? I think we're going to be able to do it over time all together.
I agree. Well, Crystal, thank you so much for joining us today. We so appreciate it, and all your words of wisdom and the great work that you're doing. I look forward to seeing what IllumiNative is doing. I know I follow all your social media channels and try to stay up to date with everything that's going on. So thank you for your work and all you do to support Indian country. It really is making a difference.
Well, thank you, and right back at you for everything that the Shakopee Mdewakan and Sioux community does for Native peoples, and for everything you're doing in the state of Minnesota. So, and thank you for your support for IllumiNative.
Thank you for joining me for the Native Minnesota podcast. For more episodes, please subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can also visit our website, understandnativemn.org, to learn more about our campaign's work to improve the Native narrative in Minnesota's public schools.